Hi, everybody. This is Nate, and this is Nate and Boomer. My name is Nate Winokur. I am a cannabis science specialist. I also specialize in cannabis root cause analysis as well as cannabis education. I am one of the founders of Bell Costa Labs, as well as a founder of Teaching Bud. And joining me today is my awesome friend Boomer. What are we here to talk about today, brother?
How's it going, guys? What's up, Nate? Thanks again for having me. My name is Brian Boomer. My company is Booms Farm, and I specialize in the cultivation side of things. Doing genetic consulting is my primary role. Today, we're going to talk about tariffs, trades, and toques. With the recent presidential election, a lot of things have been changing. We're really not sure what's going to happen, but I think we should discuss what's going to maybe happen with the supply chain. If things are going to be taxed and, tariffs for other countries, how does that look in different sectors of our industry?
That's what we're here to talk about, because one way or another, the reality is that cannabis is going to be affected by this. Virtually every sector of cannabis in some ways relies on overseas supply chains in order to get the job done. And in this way, we want to examine that, see if this is going to be a problem, see if it's going to be a long-term problem, and some of the things we anticipate needing to be done in order to possibly combat or roll rather with some of these changes that we're going to be working with. So, yeah, let's get started. Why would you say this all matters, brother?
I mean, in general, for you that are listening, whether you're a grower, manufacturer, or a consumer, it's going to matter because it's ultimately going to be a price increase to the consumer because all of this is going to affect the operators. And I know this firsthand because you guys remember COVID. Do you remember how everything stopped? Do you think that's going to happen again? Maybe not that bad. But when that did happen, I do recall a lot of our raw materials, materials, your manufacturing materials, building materials to just finish the grow, or your wood, metals, everything became scarce and limited, right? I'm not saying it's going to get that bad, but we definitely need to analyze your industry inputs and what is going to potentially be outsourced only from another country, or can it be maybe here in the US? And maybe you need to have a redundancy plan in the event that something becomes unavailable or so highly priced it's just as good as unavailable.
Yeah, good points. Good points. So tariffs and the notion that could raise costs, that might be one of the simpler ideas. Will that happen across the board, are you thinking? And in those ways, what kinds of things will be affected? And just things that, replace what you could get from the U.S.
Right.
Things that you have no choice but to get overseas, right?
Right. And just for the timeline of everything, it's February 25. So we're currently seeing things being negotiated. That's why this is a relevant discussion. I would love to reconnect in the following months and the end of the year and see truly what the fallout is. So I can only, be skeptic to truly what can happen. But a lot of stuff comes from other countries, China, Japan, Thailand, a lot of those countries that may end up having real tariffs placed on them, whether it's 50% or even we might have a hold at the ports. Again, you remember that here in Long Beach? Same thing.
Yes.
That was very real. I mean, yeah, you had your stuff ordered, you paid for it, but it's sitting. People wanted to go out the boats and get it themselves.
No, 100%.
And so I think that that's a very real possibility here coming up. And so, yeah, I mean, we can talk about, the potential raising costs, but it's really super hypothetical right now. But if you relied on, I'm going to go for the grower's perspective. If your soil costs you $100 for that bag and it's taxed 50%, I don't know all the micro and macroeconomics of how this is going to be affected, but I can only imagine it's going to go up enough. And then if you're being pressed here for selling your flower for less and all your other production costs have gone up, it's going to equal spread and thinner margins. So I see a lot of operators, depending on where you're at, having to reevaluate the inputs. We talked about this in a different episode, but supply chain disruption could entirely halt some of your production. It's the weakest link in the chain.
So you mentioned, some of these guys running it who will be affected. Let's look at, our supply chain, growers. We have, grow operations. We have extractors. We have laboratories. We have, retailers. We have the distributor, retailer, packaging aspect.
Right.
These are all going to be ones that it doesn't take a whole lot of imagination to consider what's going to be possibly impacted here. On the lab side, can speak to at least our vials, possibly the solvents down to the glassware that we could use or any containers, anything that we would use to be able to kind of shift these samples from one side of our lab to the other is, if it's a consumable product, it very likely comes from overseas. So that's speaking from my home base, that's something that's easy to see. We could go even a little bit further. A lot of the instruments get made overseas. We have a couple of Shimadzu instruments for sure. I know those come from Japan.
Right.
So that's all things that we can
And
consider.
aren't those very expensive, if I recall?
Yeah, the instruments that we use to study cannabis, I start typically in the six-figure
So
range.
your cost for capital investment could be heavily increased or replacement if you needed.
I'm curious to see what defines a product that will be tariff.
That's true.
But if this is the case, then it will be something like this that impacts the ability for a company to be able to study. Absolutely will stand in the way potentially, if not for existing businesses that already have their instruments, but for sure for hopefuls that still need to purchase a full suite,
Like in new states that are coming online.
or now the needs to hopefully purchase new instruments in the future to help scale up with cannabis changes. I mean, is this, where does it go? And it's, if we were talking about instruments, it's not just me, but what are the distributors for these instruments in the U.S.? What are they going to do?
That's true. And things do change in terms of accessibility. I do recall that certain vendors were squeezed out, distributors agreements had changed. And, a lot of these things start with your raw material sourcing. I'm going to talk about the cultivation side here for a second. What do you grow in? Cocoa, soil, rock wool. It's probably manufactured, at least the raw materials coming from another country. Highly unlikely here from the United States, right? I had this exact experience with our cocoa for our nurseries, and we ultimately ended up having to source multiple cocoa supplies, and I had to go do due diligence checks only to find out that everything was inconsistent. And by inconsistent, I mean I had a lab test for pathogens like Fusarium, which is waterborne. They come with pests. They come with heavy metals. They come with things that you didn't think were in there, right? EC and pH values that are
just from the basic perspective of running a company, having multiple sources for your product sounds like a nightmare. Like, what if, and when I say what if, of course this would happen. The product will turn out different. Like either a repetition of strains, what you're specializing in, what you had dialed in, would either be interrupted, or if you're growing the same strain in multiple types of grow media, you're going to see likely different expressions of that. Like that sounds like a nightmare just right on the base level. But what would you say? What other hardware are you seeing in there?
Well, that's just talking about the raw material, your inputs. That's for us that's like baking.
Right?
That's a consumable. So you're talking about just getting it to grow, right? If you want to install or scale up or upgrade a part of your room, irrigation equipment, lighting equipment,
the racks,
right? Yeah, dude, like almost all that is coming from overseas. And almost always, guys, if you order some of these large pieces of equipment, they come without something that you needed. And you're usually calling them and saying, hey, it's missing this item. And you're waiting 2 weeks.
Oh, I didn't even think about that.
Dude, it happens all the time, just right now, right? And so people are held up by weeks for their contractors to get one item that's hold up this entire room. It's going to happen worse with the supply chain because the QC level goes down, the profit margins go down, it squeezes out people, right? That's what happened with the cocoa.
Dude, what a swinging door, because like in recent years, it seemed like so many of these things have just become more and more accessible. And like, thank goodness, it's almost like this accessibility renaissance that we've had in the industry. And yeah, that's true. Like a big regression is what therefore could happen.
And then going back to the quality. So if your inputs change for good or better, you are going to invariably have a different result, right?
Yeah,
And
how could you not?
and you can't control. And speaking to nutrient manufacturers, like I'm wearing the Athena sweatshirt, but any of the manufacturers of nutrients and soil all face quality control swings at any given point. They're all manufactured at either same locations or different locations, but seasonality, the storage, the processing can change, and they have their own guidelines of what's acceptable. So when I go do a due diligence check and I'm seeing things like the cocoa starts off getting heat treated and it's sterilized, but then it gets packaged and sits on pallets outside in their yard, gets trucked to a hydro shop's yard or your own shop yard, and it sits. And then by the time you break it open, it might already have something in it that you don't want. A lot of the good operations will do a treatment and inoculate their own media when they do intake for this reason, but you don't want to start with excessive issues or heavy metals. Some of that is not going to be remediated.
No, that's those are big deals. And I mean, even if there is interruptions of where supply chains come from, heavy metal amounts are going to differ. And I mean, just as we've mentioned, inputs are right. I guess inputs alone in this discussion would almost be their own. But let's cover moving along though. Let's cover some of the other operations, not things we have as much immediate familiarity with, but extraction operations. I have to assume that there's steel, possibly some solvents. I can only imagine certain filter elements, certain
consumables for them.
Yep. 100%. Possibly versions of the socks or the bags that everything gets packed in. Other as mentioned, consumable items in the extraction process. Retail end, what can you think of?
For me and my
the packaging of obviously. Sorry, go on.
No, and it all ties together because you guys got to understand the flower gets cultivated at a wholesale end. Things get manufactured as pre-rolls or distillate, for your vape pens or edibles, and all that stuff does get packaged, right? And the packaging usually is going to the retail dispensary. So the dispensaries will see a big hit, and the distributions, because what's going to happen is that almost all that packaging comes from overseas. The stickers you print the labels on, the boxes, the little bags, the Mylar child safe packaging, all that stuff is most likely sourced from overseas. So when you end up bringing in an inferior product that is not what is necessary for passing compliance, child resistant packaging, proper labeling, you're in a world of hurt. You're essentially not going to be able to launch that product. You risk a recall and some serious fines.
Yeah, good points. Very good points. Everything then, in terms of then distribution through retail, when we mention child resistance, anything that goes into that, packaging, jars, certain aspects of labeling or like pre-printed products and things like that. Marketing material for sure.
Right.
That's all, all things that I would consider in that.
Yeah. Your swag stuff, right? Your sweaters, your lanyards, your pens, your lighters, like I can go on. Like, I mean, half the stuff that we all consume, especially in America, is coming from another country, and not to say that it's not an eye-opening experience for us to realize, well, maybe we domesticate some of this and we rely on the U.S. a little bit more. And is it going to shake up things? Of course, there's going to be temporary displacement, but then that's going to be on some people. Might be an entrepreneur that's going to say, I want to make it work here.
And that's the problem, is the whole thing is thrown into the wolves. If it was something that was properly managed, then being able to ease into a more of a domestic reliance actually seems like it might be a real thing. If you consider how this is going to go, it might, we're still waiting to see exactly how it's going to shape out. But if this is a thing where everything is marked up, that's a little bit of a problem. If this is just what replaces what you can make in the U.S., which I wouldn't necessarily disagree with tariffs if they were used in what I would consider to be something that would be both altruistic towards people in your own country,
right,
and something that can just generally improve things. If I'm not mistaken, in contemporary times, that's the point behind tariffs. But if it's not something you can produce here, then you're really, again, I like the term you used, world of hurt, because hopefully we don't see that type of markup, but if we do, that's going to be a very defining of how some of these decisions get made and whether or not some processes are even worth it. So let's talk there. Like, dive a little bit deeper, rather, into that, and let's talk about how tariffs affect costs. Um, just basic ideas, and we can kind of run through these in a little bit of a more in-depth way. But import tax is increasing. That's pretty straightforward. Trade war impact. What do you think about that?
I'm not necessarily educated in these areas per se, so I do tread lightly in, I guess, what my opinion may be. But as a business operator and a grower, I think about what affects my immediate circle, right? And, taxes and tariffs, I'm not saying are a bad thing. This all may result in proper reasoning, but I'm just kind of announcing the fact that you have to reevaluate your costs. I'm already conscious that the clients I'm working with have a hard enough time producing at a cash flow ability.
And we know these costs are going to be passed on to the businesses.
And the business is going to do what?
The business is going to
pass it on.
Well, yeah, I see where you're going
to
with
the
that.
customer if they're going to make any money, and you know what I mean.
You either have to pivot and become a different kind of company, or if people like you enough, you're right. You have to count on them.
Either lean out and or increase.
And you have to count on people paying a premium for you to survive, which I guess that's really the squeeze here. That's really the ebb and flow, and that is what inflation is, right?
Right.
So,
and that's going to be something that's going to be a moving target, I guess is what I'm saying. You're just going to have to manage monthly all of your costs and be on your toes, for anything to change, and just have redundancies. Yes, you would like to have one vendor supply, but you're going to need 2, 3, or 4. And this is what we started doing back when the COVID days happened and supply chain disruption really did. It's just time consuming, and again, it's a cost that you are just going to have to look at squeezing your production elsewhere and getting creative and, or, maybe passing on a little bit, to the customer. Yes, inflation is there, and, there's a lot of things that are affecting that, will ultimately, I think this year we'll see how the prices do. But if the pack prices are the same now and the growers are already not making money and their cost to produce goes up, I don't know what you think is going to happen. I don't think they're going to stick around. They're not working for free. They're already stressed as it is. So if you want good weed, you're going to pay for it. And you, the consumer, have the ability to support with your dollar what weed you like. And I like the whole idea of support your farmer and know the brands and believe in what they're about. If you don't care, that's fine. You're going to spend less money on weed that you don't care about, and that company may or may not be around ultimately.
So what do you think, and that's, I think, a very awesome statement to who we know and love, the craft farmer, those people who specialize in, small batch and everything's awesome. And that's, obviously the kind of weed you and I like to fuck with and that kind of stuff. And that's where, what we have close to our heart. I see that, though, oftentimes, and not to say that there are no large-scale craft operations, but a lot of the small businesses will be affected differently than the large-scale businesses, right?
I would say so.
So what do you think? And I ask this from like a grower perspective, having worked with both sides of the spectrum, right? Small businesses and large scale businesses. How do you see this affecting the large scale versus small scale grow operations differently?
I mean, a large scale operation has a little bit more budget typically to stockpile and buy at a discounted rate. So I've seen that advantage work where we usually buy 3 months in advance and we'll buy it at a better price. You as a smaller operator may not have that budget. You might be a little bit more in tune also than maybe a bigger company. Some big companies are not watching their profit and loss sheet as tightly as some would be.
I hear that.
A real grower, owner, operator is seeing value in the product that he's using. He's not on a C level seat looking at data where he's just seeing yield and sales, right? That's a different KPI. I think that the two are going to be facing a similar path of assessing and pivoting and going in a direction that they think is valuable to their core revenue driver. A small operator is probably going to focus on a craft product and a brand, and their input costs might not matter as much because they're seeing a little bit more of a premium on the back end. That's something to be said. They might have a lower overhead and risk associated with that operation. If you have 1,000 lights and you have a 50,000 square foot building and all that staff and insurance and rent to pay, can you manage that when the market is squished like that? That is also as concerning as just buying in bulk.
Well said. Yeah, that's a frightening thought, if things were to go south from there. So, yeah, that makes sense. So, let's say, it doesn't go all the way south. There will be adaptation, right? What will these adaptations be? First things first, buy local, right? That's if you can get it there, get it there. You mentioned stockpiling. That's huge. And, if you can, you buy in bulk. There's also things like trade groups and buying groups and stuff like that. That's emerged in tough times for various industries.
Like a cooperative, right? Almost.
Yeah.
Collective, whatever.
Non-weed,
yeah.
Have things gone full circle, man? Have they? Like the idea of cutting costs versus quality. Like let's talk about and kind of float in there. We're talking about adapting to the supply changes and what can you do? And you started, kind of just by, leading down this direction already. There are reasons to stockpile materials, especially on the grow end.
So everything, because you're talking about from a lab to a manufacturer who's buying things, and the gases and their consumables is still the same for them to operate, because manufacturing labs, they can produce a lot in one day, so one day down is a lot of money to them. A grow takes 30 to 60 days of manufacturing grow time for them to have increased anything in terms of value. I would look at the buy in bulk if you can afford it, but you need to know that product is valuable in terms of your supply chain. If it's not the right product, don't be over ordering it, and maybe it's just better to err on the side of buying what you think you need. And if it's not working or the price is changing or not available, now you're not relying on it. A lot of this does result in R&D too, research and development and trialing and erroring. I'm a proponent of that as an ongoing lean management style too, where somebody's looking to optimize their yield, they're optimizing their output, but they're also cutting their costs, right? And things like cutting costs and, the quality is, I just kind of said it, is the small versus the big operators. The bigger operators are probably going to look at their line items and chop out things to reduce their costs, but it might result in maybe a lesser than premium product. On the opposite, a smaller operator that's focused on a more premium product has a higher cost of input, but they're realistically able to still maintain and charge a premium for that product. The concern is, will the consumers be able to afford it? I just don't know where that market's going to go.
No, all very valid points. Very eye-opening. Yeah, thank you for that. That's, I think, a really good segue into not just adapting, but how long will you have to adapt for? Is this a long-term problem, short-term problem? We don't really know yet. But, for the sake of some doomsday saying, what may we be running into if tariffs stay?
I think as is with anything, every year the costs are always up and down. So it's just going to be a bigger target to address, I guess, and you and I have been around plenty of years in this industry. And it's not just the cost of inputs that have been a dynamic challenge. There's a lot of cultural challenges and political challenges that we're faced with. And I think that you just have to be nimble. And, I like working with, my peers and having a network in this kind of community where we're sharing and educating and really focusing on current events, because there's plenty of grow books and other, manufacturing books on how to extract and all that. But those are fundamentally processes, right? Those are not going to help you adapt and maybe stay ahead of the curve, is maybe what we're trying to do and accomplish here. When things are going weird, I'm calling my peers and I'm checking with them and seeing what they're doing and also seeing, right? And I think that that's why this podcast is important, because now we're actually able to get together, have these discussions about some of the challenges, talk to you guys, see what your thoughts are. And in 3 to 6 months, I think we should reconnect on this and see where things went. And that might be a better barometer to our hypothesis here.
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways this is going to be we'll have the opportunity, of course, to record and then continue to talk about these things as they go. And hopefully the trend that we see as we look back will be getting more and more grim, right? In that sense, these long term, if these are long term issues, long term things we have to work with, domestic manufacturing, that might be one of the few happy sides of this, is that I have seen domestic manufacturing on some levels. Out in Costa Mesa, there's a major company where I saw thousands of those tube style products. It's one of the
The
marijuana
plastic
packaging.
packages. Yeah.
So thousands of the tube style products being produced per minute. I mean, they were massive plastic injector, machines.
Molds, yeah.
That all it did was just fire these things out at machine gun rates, and it was so impressive. There's already been, in other words, a little people who have realized how advantageous it can be to produce some of these things that you might be classically used to seeing made available overseas and having to be shipped. Some people manufacture them here. And so in some ways, that's for packaging already a thing. I have to say that that might be the happy side of it, is that we see more of that. And that if we're forced to, just based, on some of these ideas alone, that, you could say that a company who already figured out how to manufacture a plastic consumable product where you store your joints in, if somebody who already figured out how to do that and make it profitable and worthwhile in the U.S. here, it's only going to be like shining as that much more of an example potentially of how things will go and what people will have to do and so forth.
Right.
So it just, domestic manufacturing will be interesting. We'll just see. And for some of the stuff that was just really expensive to begin with, like when you look at some manufacturing equipment, like giant rotovaps, even if something from China is 3 times more expensive, might be still the cheapest, usable one on the market. So it's hard to say, like there's, people I would like to imagine be able to roll with these punches, but it won't, if it goes to that level, it won't be easy. Thoughts?
Thinking about all this stuff definitely has always kind of got me thinking a lot about the last few episodes that we've had where, prevention and mitigation planning has been kind of important, and it's really hard to predict the future. So I don't really like to chase that, too much. But when you start seeing the writing on the wall, I think that it's time to, acknowledge some of those indicators, those warnings, and, just have a couple of backup plans and considerations. And, I really think right now that the future is going to be quality. I know that price matters, but if you can find a way to produce quality and still profit, regardless of the scale, I think that has longevity, and I think that will stand out. Of course, there's going to be the large companies that will have a budget and the ability to float through a lot of this challenge, and they may not be putting out the quality that you're looking for. But this goes back to having that option of the consumer. You can choose which side you want. It's just if you're on an operator side and you're looking to, I guess be adapting to these situations, you're going to have to be listening to the streets, and things like we're discussing are going to be very important.
Yeah, well said. Good points all around, man. I totally agree with everything stated, and I'm, as you've kind of pointed out, I'm looking forward to the opportunity to look back at this from a historical standpoint and see how, from this seat, how everything gets impacted. So, please keep with us on this topic and let us know your thoughts. Really happy to keep pushing this type of information out. Really stoked that you've joined me here, brother. So thank you, everyone, so much for joining us. And until next time.
Take care, guys.